My name is Imogen Faulkner. I am 34 years old. And at the receiving line after my father's funeral, my stepmother, who I had hated for 22 years, walked up to me, placed a sealed cream-colored envelope in my hand, and asked me to read it before I left the funeral home. Then, she did something I had never in 2 decades of knowing her, seen her do. She apologized. She apologized for asking. She apologized for being there at all. She apologized for the timing. She apologized for, in her words, every day since the 2nd of February 1996. Then she turned and walked out a side door, alone, in a black wool coat that was too thin for the November wind in Cleveland, and she did not come back. I stood in the receiving line with the envelope in my left hand, and a tissue in my right, and 40 more people waiting to shake my hand and tell me how sorry they were that my father had died. I could not put the envelope in my purse because my purse was on a chair across the room. I could not open it because 40 people were watching. I could not throw it away because my brother Holden, 4 steps behind me, would have seen me throw it away and asked what it was. And I did not yet know what it was, and I had learned 22 years ago that the safe thing to do with anything that came from Ira Faulkner was to handle it carefully, with both hands, the way you handle a thing that might bite. So I held it. I held it through the rest of the receiving line. I held it through Mrs. Garrison from my father's church, and Mr. Petrosky from his bowling league, and a young woman named Avery, who was the daughter of one of his former clients, and who had come, she said, because my father had been kind to her family during her own mother's illness in 2009. I held it through my Aunt Marisol, who had flown in from Phoenix, and through my college roommate Sahar, who had driven up from Pittsburgh, and through a man named Lon, who I had never met, but who had served in the National Guard with my father in 1984, and who shook my hand for a long time without speaking. I held the envelope through all of them. The paper had warmed against my palm by the end. The seal was a small round of dried wax, the color of dark wine, with a single letter pressed into it. The letter was an E. I want to tell you about Ira Faulkner so that you can understand the size of what was in my hand. I will tell you the version of her I carried for 22 years, and I will tell it as I carried it, because the carrying is part of the story. The reframing is going to happen later. The reframing is going to happen because of what was in the envelope. But you cannot reframe a thing without first standing where the picture used to be, and the picture I stood inside, for 22 years, was a picture in which my stepmother was the woman who had taken my mother's place too quickly, and then proceeded, with a quiet and relentless precision, to make my childhood smaller than it should have been. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where ordinary women face impossible families and walk out with their dignity intact. If you have ever spent 20 years sure of who hurt you, and then learned, in one quiet afternoon, that you were sure of something you had only half seen, this one is for you. Drop a comment, tell me where you're listening from, and be sure to subscribe. Ira Faulkner came into our house in February of 1996. I was 12. My brother Holden was 9. Our mother, Saoirse Faulkner, had died 14 months earlier of a brain tumor that had taken 8 months from diagnosis to grave. Ira had been our mother's hospice nurse for the last 6 weeks. That is how she met our father. That is how she met us. She moved into the house 7 months after my mother's funeral. She and my father married in a courthouse the following May, with no guests except for my mother's sister Marisol, who flew in from Phoenix and did not say a single word to Ira the entire weekend except, at the dinner after the courthouse, pass the bread. I did not pass the bread. I refused to pass the bread. I sat at the table and watched my father marry the woman who had been at my mother's bedside 14 months earlier, and I made a decision, at 12 years old, that the woman across the table from me had been waiting for something. I made the decision in the way 12-year-olds make decisions, which is to say I made it absolutely, without nuance, and I did not revise it. Ira had been waiting. Ira had wanted my father. Ira had used her position as my mother's nurse to insert herself into the house. Ira had married my widowed father 7 months later, because she had been planning to from the beginning. That was the story. I locked it in. I built the next 22 years on top of it. Ira was a cold woman. That part was real. She was thin and pale and quiet, and she wore her hair in a low knot at the back of her head, and she did not laugh easily, and she did not raise her voice, which somehow made her quietness more frightening than any other woman's anger would have been. She enforced rules in the house that had not existed before her, like a strict bedtime, and a rotation of household chores, and a Sunday meal where everyone had to sit at the table for an hour with no books and no television. She would not let me visit my friend Kira's house after 7 on a school night. She would not let me wear my mother's perfume. She threw out, in the 3rd year, a sweater of my mother's that I had been keeping in my bedroom closet, claiming the moths had gotten to it. She would not let me have a boyfriend until I was 17. She would not let me drive my mother's car, which sat in the garage for 14 years, until my father finally sold it the year I graduated from college. She would not let me, for reasons I never understood, attend a school dance with a boy named Hollis DeMarco, who I had been desperate to attend a dance with in 9th grade. She told my father, who told me, that the dance was not a good idea, that the boy was not a good idea, that I would understand someday. I did not understand someday. I understood, that day, that Ira had taken from me an evening I had wanted, with a boy I had wanted to want me, and she had used my father as her instrument to do it. I added it to the ledger. The ledger was long. I left for college at 18. I never came back to live in the house, except for one summer between sophomore and junior year, which I spent largely at my friend Kira's apartment to avoid Ira. I called my father once a week. I sent Ira a Christmas card every year, with my signature alone, never anything written above it. I attended Thanksgivings and Easters when I could not avoid them. I shook Ira's hand at every family event. I did not hug her. I did not call her by her first name in conversation. I called her, when I had to, your wife. It was an open and continuous and willed estrangement, conducted with quiet civility, for 22 years. I had not, in those 22 years, ever once been alone in a room with Era Faulkner, by my own choice. And now, in my left hand, was a sealed envelope she had asked me to read before I left the funeral home, and I had not yet decided whether to read it at all. To understand the envelope, I have to tell you about my father first, and about the kind of marriage my parents had before my mother got sick, because everything I thought I knew about Ira was a story I had built in opposition to the story of my parents, and the two stories were one story, told in two directions, and I had only ever been able to see one side of it. My father, Anders Faulkner, was a tall, slow-moving, quiet man. He had grown up in Duluth, in a Norwegian-American family that did not speak unless something needed saying. He had been an electrical engineer at a power company for 36 years. He came home at 5:15 every weekday for 36 years. He read the paper at the kitchen table for 40 minutes every evening before dinner. He drank one beer on Friday nights and not at any other time. He wore the same pair of brown leather work boots, resoled 4 times, for 19 years. He was the kind of man who would not allow himself any expression of unhappiness, because he had been raised by a father who had not allowed himself any expression of unhappiness, and who had punished any expression of unhappiness from my father with a silence that lasted, in one case I knew of, 3 weeks. My father never punished us with silence. He had absorbed the silence so completely that it had become his weather. He did not impose it. He just was it. My mother Saoirse had been everything my father was not. She was Irish, dark-haired, loud, funny, opinionated, magnetic. She was a high school history teacher. She told stories at the dinner table that made my brother and me cry with laughter. She sang in the car. She danced badly and on purpose in our kitchen on Saturday mornings while she made pancakes. She read out loud to us until I was 14, even though I had been able to read since I was 4, because she said reading aloud was an act of love, and she was going to keep loving us out loud as long as we would let her. She was the noisy, bright, animating force in a house that, without her, would have settled back into the silence my father had been raised in. And then she got sick. The headaches started in the spring of my 5th grade year. The diagnosis came in October. Glioblastoma, stage 4. The surgery was in November. It did not work. The chemo and radiation started in December. They did not work either. By summer, she was at home, in the master bedroom with hospice care. That is when Ira came into the house. She was 33. She had been a hospice nurse for 9 years at that point. She was assigned to my mother in the last 6 weeks. She came every weekday morning at 8 and stayed until 2. She came on Saturdays for half a day. She did the work of dying with my mother, which is mostly invisible work, and which I, at 12, did not understand at all. I understood only that my mother was vanishing, and that this thin, pale, quiet woman with the low knot of hair was the person in the room with her when I was at school, and that I resented the quiet woman for being there when I could not be, even as I needed her to be there, because my father could not be home from work, and someone had to. My mother died on a Tuesday in November. I came home from school. The house was full of people. Ira was at the kitchen table with my father. Both of them sitting. Both of them silent. My father's hands flat on the table in front of him, the way he always sat when he was overwhelmed. Ira had a cup of coffee in front of her. She stood up when I came in. She did not move toward me. She just stood up. She said, "Imogen, I am so sorry. Your mother is gone. Your father is here. I will go now. I am very sorry." Then she put on her coat and walked out the back door. My father did not stand up. He just sat there. I went to my mother's room. The bed was empty. The bed had been made up with fresh sheets. The room smelled clean. Someone had already taken my mother away. I learned, years later, that it had been Ira who had organized the body's removal. Because my father had not been able to make the phone call, and Ira had stepped quietly outside the room and made the call herself before I got home from school, and the funeral home had come and taken my mother away, while my father sat at the kitchen table, with his hands flat on the wood. I did not know that day. I did not know it for a long time. I only knew that I came home, and my mother was gone. For the next year, my father did the thing widowed fathers in his generation did, which was to barely function. He went to work. He came home. He sat at the kitchen table. He read the paper. He did not cook. My grandmother, my mother's mother, came to stay with us for the first 3 months, and made dinners, and did laundry, and bathed Holden, and walked me through the first long, hard weeks of being a girl whose mother was dead. Then my grandmother went back to Phoenix. After that, we ate a lot of frozen meals and cereal. The house got dusty. The laundry piled up. My father did not, I think, know how to ask for help. He had been raised to absorb hardship in silence, and he was absorbing this hardship in silence too. And he was failing, slowly and politely, the way men of his temperament fail. Then, Ira reappeared. Not as a wife. Not as a romantic figure. Not yet. She started showing up, every other Saturday at first, in jeans and a sweater, with a casserole dish or a basket of clean laundry she had picked up at the dry cleaner, because she had been in the neighborhood. She would stay for an hour. She would talk to my father about practical things. Gently, she would ask Holden how school was going. She did not address me directly very often, because by then I had begun, with the precision of a 12-year-old's wounded heart, to glare at her with everything I had. She accepted the glare. She did not respond to it. She continued to come. I told myself then that she was insinuating herself. I told myself she was a vulture. I told myself that the hospice nurse always falls for the widower, that I had read about it somewhere, that this was a known pattern, that she had been waiting in the wings. I told myself a story that allowed me to keep loving my mother by hating Ira. The two loves were architecturally connected. Loving my mother required, in my 12-year-old emotional calculus, hating the woman who appeared after her. I locked the architecture in. I am 34 now. I am old enough to know, in retrospect, that the architecture was wrong. But on the day of the funeral, with the envelope in my hand, I was still standing inside the architecture. The architecture had been my house for 22 years. I had not been ready to leave it. The envelope was about to require me to. I did not open the envelope at the funeral home. I made it through the rest of the receiving line. I went to the gathering at my father's house, the house I had grown up in. The house Ira had lived in for the last 22 years. The house she would now, presumably, continue to live in. I sat in the living room with my brother Holden and his wife Camilla and their 2 boys, and with my Aunt Marisol, and with Sahar, and with a dozen other people from my father's life. I ate a piece of casserole that Mrs. Garrison had brought. I drank a cup of black coffee that I did not need. Ira was not at the gathering. She had not come. She had asked Holden, before she left the funeral home, to host the gathering for her, because she did not think she would be welcome in her own house today, with Imogen there. Holden had told me this in a low voice when I arrived. He had said it without comment, the way Holden says most things, because Holden, at 31, has always been the kind of brother who keeps the temperature in the room low. He did not editorialize on Ira's decision. He simply reported it. I had nodded. I had not thanked Ira for staying away, because I did not want to thank her for anything. I had also not, in that moment, felt the relief I had expected to feel at her absence. I had felt, instead, a small and unfamiliar pang of something I could not name. I noted it. I set it aside. I would attend to it later. The envelope sat in my purse on the back of a kitchen chair for 2 hours. I finally went outside, around 5 in the afternoon, when the sky was already turning that particular Cleveland November purple that means winter is 6 days away. I sat on the front porch. The porch had been screened in for the last 15 years. The screen muted the sound of the street. I had loved this porch as a child. My mother and I had spent summer evenings on it, reading, side by side, in the 2 wicker chairs that Ira had, in the 3rd year, painted a different color than my mother had chosen, and which I had never forgiven her for. The chairs were still there. They were sage green now. They had been a faded lavender when my mother had owned them. I had been furious about the sage green. I was now, sitting in one of the chairs as an adult, noticing for the first time that the sage green actually looked correct against the white screens, and that the lavender, which I remembered as warm and inviting, had probably looked, by the time my mother died, faded and chipped. I did not want to notice this. I noticed it anyway. I took the envelope out of my purse. I held it for a long time. I broke the seal with my thumbnail. Inside were 3 things. A handwritten letter, 4 pages, on cream-colored stationery. A smaller second envelope, sealed, with my mother's name on the front in handwriting I recognized as my mother's, and a folded photocopy of a single page, which I did not unfold yet. I read the letter first. Imogen, it began. The handwriting was Ira's. She had a careful, upright handwriting, like someone who had once been a nursing student and had been taught to make her charting legible. You do not know me. That is my fault. I want you to know that I have understood that, for 22 years, the version of me that you carry has not been the actual me. I have not corrected the version. I have not tried to. I will tell you, in this letter, why I did not try. I will not ask you to forgive me. I do not deserve to be forgiven, because I have not, in any visible way, earned it. I will only ask you to read this through to the end, and to make whatever decision you make afterward with the full information that I have not, until now, given you. Your father has asked me, in the last weeks of his life, to give this to you on the day of his funeral. He has asked me to give it to you, specifically on the day of his funeral, because he wanted me to be the one to hand it to you. And he wanted you to receive it on a day when you had already done the hardest thing a daughter can do for a father. He thought you would be more able to read it on that day than on any other. I am following his instructions. There are 2 things in this envelope besides this letter. The first is a sealed letter from your mother to you, which she wrote on the 3rd of October, 1995, 4 weeks before she died. She wrote it on a Tuesday afternoon, in the master bedroom, while I was sitting beside her. She gave it to me, sealed. She asked me to give it to you on the day of your father's funeral, not before. She made me promise. I am keeping her promise. The second is a photocopy of a single page from your father's medical records. The page is dated the 17th of December, 1994, the morning after a hospital admission your father underwent that you were not told about. You were 10 years old. You were at school. Your mother was with him in the emergency room. He stayed in the hospital for 3 nights. He told you, when you asked, that he had taken a business trip to Akron. He had not been in Akron. He had been at St. Luke's. He had been admitted to the psychiatric unit on a 72-hour hold, following an attempt on his own life. I will tell you, plainly, because you have a right to know, that your father attempted suicide on the night of the 16th of December, 1994, in the garage, with the car running. Your mother found him. Your mother called the ambulance. Your mother saved him. He survived. He never tried again. He spent the next 30 years carrying the weight of what he had nearly done. He told 3 people in his life about it. He told your mother. He told the psychiatrist who treated him at St. Luke's. He told me, in the year after your mother died, when he was again sliding into the same condition that had nearly killed him in 1994, and when I, as his nurse, and then as his friend, and then as his wife, had to decide what to do about a man I could see was disappearing in front of me, and to whom he had become deeply attached, who had also 2 children, one of whom had already begun to hate me on sight. I am writing this so that you understand. I am not writing it to defend myself. I am writing it because your father is gone, and there is no one left to tell you. I am telling you. I am the last person who knew. I owe you the telling. I stopped reading. I had to. I set the letter down on the wicker chair beside me. The sage green chair. The chair I had hated for 22 years for being the wrong color. I stared at it for a long time. I had not known my father had ever tried. I had not known anything. I picked the letter back up. I kept reading. The letter went on for 3 more pages. Ira's handwriting did not change. The careful upright shapes continued, line after line, the way a woman writes when she has been preparing the sentences in her head for a very long time. She told me, on those pages, what she had not been able to tell me for 22 years. She told me that in the months after my mother died, my father had begun, very quietly, to slide. He had not been eating. He had been losing weight. He had been sleeping in the recliner in the living room because he could not bear the bedroom. He had been drinking, not heavily by some standards, but heavily by his standards, 3 beers on a weeknight instead of the 1 beer on a Friday. He had stopped going to his bowling league. He had stopped reading the paper. He had been arriving at work later and later. His supervisor at the power company, a man named Ned Holcomb, had called Ira on a Thursday afternoon in the 7th month after my mother's death. Ned Holcomb had been the only other person besides my mother and the psychiatrist to know about the 1994 hospitalization. He had known because he had covered for my father at work during the 3 nights. Ned Holcomb had called Ira because Ira had given my mother her personal number, months earlier, in case anything happened after hours, and the number had ended up taped to the inside of my father's wallet, in my mother's handwriting, with the note, "Call her if Anders needs help." My mother had put it there. My mother had known. My mother had been preparing for what she suspected might happen after she was gone. Ira had received Ned Holcomb's call. She had driven over to our house that evening. She had let herself in with the spare key that my mother had given her during the hospice weeks. She had found my father in the basement. She had not, she wrote, found him in the act of anything. She had found him sitting on the basement floor, in the dark, with his head in his hands. He had been crying. He had not been able to stop. He had been crying for an hour before she arrived. He had told her, that night, what he had done in 1994. He had told her that he was not sure he could keep going. He had told her that the children were the only thing keeping him here. He had told her he was afraid of his own thoughts. He had told her he did not know what to do. Ira had stayed. She had not left. She had sat on the basement floor with him, that first night, until 2 in the morning, and she had listened. She was a hospice nurse. She knew how to sit with people whose interior lives were collapsing. She knew how to be present without being intrusive. She knew how to ask the small, careful questions that allow a person to hear their own thinking out loud. She did this with my father. She did it for 3 hours. The next morning, she called St. Luke's. She had a contact there from her work. She arranged for my father to see the psychiatrist who had treated him in 1994. She drove him to the appointment. She drove him to 4 more appointments over the next 3 weeks. She did not tell anyone what she was doing. She did not tell us. She did not tell my grandmother. She did not tell Aunt Marisol. She did not tell Ned Holcomb, who already knew, but who never asked. She simply, quietly, on her own time, kept my father alive. She wrote, in the letter, that at some point during those weeks, she had begun to love him. She wrote that she was not proud of this. She wrote that she had felt then, what she still felt 22 years later, which was a deep, lasting awareness that she had fallen in love with a man whose wife she had just nursed through death, and that this was, in some essential sense, an indecency she would never be able to undo. She wrote that she had tried, for the first 2 months, to keep her distance. She had stopped coming over. She had told my father he needed to find a therapist he could continue with, and that she could not be the person who kept him alive, because that was not a stable arrangement. She had withdrawn. My father had then, she wrote, called her 3 weeks later, very late on a Sunday night, and told her he was again afraid of his own thoughts. And could she please come? She had come. She had not, after that, left. She had moved into the house 7 months after my mother's funeral, because my father had asked her to, because he had told her, plainly, that he believed he would not survive without her in the house. She had said yes, because she had loved him by then, and because she had calculated, in the way nurses calculate, that the cost of refusing was too high. She had been, she wrote, perfectly aware of how this looked. She had been aware that it looked like the worst version of itself. She had been aware that I, at 12 years old, would see her as a vulture. She had decided that I had the right to that perception. She had decided not to defend herself. She had decided not to defend herself for one specific reason, and the reason was the second thing in the envelope. The photocopy. The page from my mother's records. I unfolded the photocopy. It was not a page from my father's medical records. It was a page from my mother's. Specifically, it was a page from the personal notebook my mother had kept during her last weeks, which had been preserved by the hospice agency along with my mother's other medical documentation, and which Ira had retained access to because she had been my mother's nurse of record. The page was dated the 3rd of October, 1995. The handwriting was my mother's. It was hard to read. My mother had been losing fine motor control by then. The pen had skipped. But the words were legible. The words were these. I will read them to you exactly as they were written, because they were my mother's last sentences to me, and they belong, in their original form, to no one else. To Era. Please, when I am gone. Anders will not survive alone. He has tried once. He will try again. The children will not save him by themselves. They are too young. He cannot ask them to. Please, stay close to him, whatever shape that takes. I am not asking you to be his wife. I am not asking for anything but presence. He needs presence. He needs someone in the house. He needs someone who will see when he is sliding. The children are too young to see it. They will need you too. They will not know they need you. Imogen will hate you. Imogen hates anyone who is not me. She will outgrow it, eventually, but it will take a long time. Be patient with her. She has always been my fierce one. Her fierceness is going to be a beautiful thing in her adulthood, but it will be difficult to live with as a child. Please, be patient. Do not defend yourself. She will reach you on her own time. She will. I promise you she will. Sirsh. I sat on the porch with the photocopy in my hand. I did not move. I do not know how long I sat there. The sky finished turning purple and started going to charcoal. The temperature dropped. Holden came out at one point and asked if I was okay. I said yes. I said I needed a few minutes. He left me alone. I sat there and the architecture of my entire life began. Slowly, like a roof beam coming loose. To bend. I want to tell you what I felt. Sitting on the porch, with my mother's handwriting in my lap, and Ira's careful upright letters on the wicker chair beside me. I felt, first, a kind of shame so complete that my body could not find a way to express it. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not move. I sat there because the body, when confronted with information that requires the entire inner architecture to be rebuilt, sometimes simply holds still while the rebuilding begins. I had spent 22 years constructing a person who did not exist. I had built that person carefully, brick by brick. Out of small details, the sage green chairs, the thrown-out sweater, the cancelled school dance, the perfume I was not allowed to wear, the dozen small moments where Ira had made a decision I did not understand, and which I had filed under cruelty. I had built her into a villain, because the villain made a story I could survive. The story was that my mother had been taken from me, and that a woman had stepped into the gap, and that I, the daughter, had been the only person clear-sighted enough to see what had happened. That story had given me an enemy. The enemy had given me a place to put my grief. The grief had been so large that without an enemy to direct it at, it would have collapsed me at 12 years old, and so I had built the enemy because the alternative, the truth, which was that my mother was dead, and my father was barely holding on, and a stranger had walked into the house to keep him alive at my mother's own written request, was a truth I had not been equipped to hold. A child cannot hold a truth like that. A child needs a villain. I had needed Ira to be a villain. Because Ira being a villain meant my mother had still been protecting me from a usurper, even after death, and the protection had been mine to carry. The protection had been the last thing my mother had given me. If I let go of the protection, I would have to let my mother go. Fully. Finally. And I had not been able to do that. I had not been able to do that until I was 34 years old, sitting on a porch in November, holding a piece of paper my mother had written 4 weeks before she died, asking, by name, the woman I had spent 22 years hating to please save my family, the sweater, the perfume, the school dance, the car, the chairs. I sat there, and I went through them, one by one, with the new information. The sweater had not been thrown out. I had been 13 at the time. I had screamed at Ira. I had accused her, in front of my father, of destroying my mother's things. My father had backed her up, gently, and the matter had been dropped. I had filed it as one of the cruelest things she had ever done. I now remembered, sitting on the porch, that the sweater had been a heavy gray cardigan that my mother had worn during chemo. The sweater had been in my closet because I had taken it from my mother's drawer 6 months after she died, and slept with it under my pillow for a year. The sweater had begun to smell different. I had noticed, around the time it was thrown out, that the smell of my mother was leaving it, and I had been devastated. Ira had not thrown the sweater out. Ira had, I now realized, possibly taken the sweater out of my closet because she had seen me growing more and more dependent on it, and because she had been afraid of what it was doing to me. She had absorbed the resulting fury without defending herself. She had not told me where the sweater really was. The sweater had probably been in a box, somewhere in the house, the whole time. The sweater had probably still been there. I would, I realized, be able to find the sweater if I asked her. The school dance with Hollis DeMarco. I had been 14. Hollis had been a junior. Hollis had been 17. I had not understood, at 14, what it might mean for a 14-year-old girl to attend a school dance with a 17-year-old boy. Ira had understood. She had refused the dance. My father had backed her up. I had been furious. I now sat on the porch with a different understanding of the dance. I sat with it for a long time. I added it to the list of things I had filed wrong. The car. My mother's car. I had wanted to drive my mother's car at 16. Ira had said no. Ira had told my father the car was not safe, the brakes had needed work. The tires were old. I had not believed her. I had been certain she had been depriving me, on purpose, of the one tangible thing my mother had left. I now thought, sitting on the porch in the dark, that perhaps Ira had been right about the brakes. I thought, also, that even if she had been wrong about the brakes, the question of whether a 16-year-old should be allowed to drive her dead mother's car was not, in fact, an obviously settled question, and that an adult might reasonably have hesitated. The chairs. The sage green chairs. The lavender chairs had been peeling and chipped by the time my mother died. Ira had repainted them. I had been 13 at the time, watching her sand the lavender off in the backyard. I had been furious. I had told her, that day, that she had no right. She had not responded. She had finished sanding. She had repainted them sage green. The chairs had lasted 22 more years because she had taken care of them. I sat on the porch with the chairs. I had been wrong about everything. Not entirely. There were probably real things Ira had done wrong. There would be. There always are. 22 years is a long time. People are not perfect, even when they are quietly trying to keep a man alive, and his children fed, and his house running, and his daughter held at arm's length, because the daughter cannot bear to be closer. There would be small failures. There would be moments where Ira had been cold when she could have been warm, where she had been efficient when she could have been generous. But the architecture I had built, the whole vast indicting architecture, was wrong. The architecture had been built around the wrong woman. I had been pointing at the wrong target for 2 decades. I picked up the second envelope. The one with my mother's name on the front in her own handwriting. The one Ira had been holding, sealed, for 22 years. I opened it. I read it. I will not tell you what was in my mother's letter to me. That letter is mine. I will only tell you that my mother said 3 things in it. She told me she loved me. She told me she was sorry to leave me. And she told me, in the last paragraph, that she had asked Ira to be in the house, and that I should, when I was ready, let Ira in. She used the words "let her in." She said it would take time. She said she understood it would take time. She said she was not asking me to be ready before I was ready. She was only asking me, eventually, to let her in. I sat on the porch. I let the letter sit in my lap. I cried, finally, for the first time that day. I did not cry for my father. I did not cry for my mother. I cried for the 22-year-old version of myself, and the 17-year-old version, and the 13-year-old version, and the 12-year-old version, who had all been so certain, who had all been so brave, who had all been so completely and utterly wrong, and who had built a fortress in their own chest against a woman who had been, the whole time, on their side. I stayed on the porch for another 20 minutes. The sky finished going dark. I could hear the gathering inside winding down. People were getting their coats. Someone had brought out cookies. A car door slammed in the driveway. I folded everything back into the envelope. The letter from Era. The photocopy of my mother's note. The letter from my mother to me. I held the envelope. I sat in the sage green chair. I thought about what I was going to do. I want to be honest with you about how complicated the next part was. I would like to tell you that I rose up from the chair like a heroine in a film, walked directly into the house, called Era on the phone, drove to wherever she was, and apologized in a beautiful, tearful scene that lasted 6 minutes and resolved 22 years of estrangement. That is not what happened. What happened is that I sat in the chair and did the math of how to begin to repair a thing I had broken slowly across 2 decades. I am 34 years old. I am old enough to know that apologies for small things can be made quickly, and apologies for very large things cannot. The apology I owed Ira was a large one. It would not be repaired in one evening. It would not be repaired in one conversation. It would be repaired, if it could be repaired at all, in the slow, patient way that adult relationships are repaired, which is one small honest contact at a time, over a period of years, until the new contact accumulates enough mass to displace the old absence. I also thought about Era's coat. The black wool coat that had been too thin for the November wind. I thought about her walking out of the funeral home alone. I thought about her not being at the gathering because she had decided she would not be welcome in her own house with me there. I thought about the fact that she had been the one to organize the funeral, the obituary, the burial plot, the catering, the receiving line, the church, the pastor, the flowers. She had done all of that work for my father, who she had been married to for 22 years, and she had then absented herself from the gathering because she had not wanted to upset me. She had done that. She was, at that very moment, presumably alone, in a coat that was too thin, somewhere in Cleveland, on the night of her husband's funeral, because of me. I stood up. I went inside. I told Holden I needed to leave for a little while. I asked him if he could host the rest of the gathering. He looked at me for a long second. He said, "Imogen, are you okay?" I said, "I need to find Ira." He nodded. He said, "She told me, before she left, that if you asked, she would be at the diner on Lakeshore. She said she would stay there until 10. She said she wanted to give you the option." I will tell you that this almost ended me, all over again. She had given me the option. She had sat in a diner on Lakeshore for hours on the night of her husband's funeral, on the chance that I might come looking for her. I got my coat. I got my keys. I drove to the diner. It was the diner she and my father had gone to on Sunday mornings for 15 years. I had been there with them, twice, both times under duress, both times sitting at the table with my arms crossed and my mouth tight. The diner was called Marv's. It had been there since 1958. It had a counter with red vinyl stools and booths along the windows. I parked in the small lot. I sat in my car for 2 minutes before I got out. I had not yet decided what to say. I went in. The bell on the door rang. The diner was almost empty. A waitress was wiping the counter. Ira was in the third booth from the door, on the right side. She had a cup of coffee in front of her. She was looking out the window. Her hands were on the table, one wrapped around the cup, one flat on the formica. She was 65 years old. She had aged in 22 years. Her hair was almost entirely gray now. The low knot at the back of her head was the same shape. She was wearing the black wool coat. She had not taken it off. She saw me come in. She did not move. She watched me cross the diner. I stopped at the edge of the booth. "Ira," I said. "Imogen," she said. I did not know what came next. I had thought about it the whole drive. I had not landed on the words. "May I sit down?" Yes, I slid into the booth across from her. I put the envelope on the table between us, the letter from her and the letter from my mother and the photocopy of my mother's handwriting all visible. I looked at her. I tried to speak. I could not. She watched me try. She did not help me. She did not rescue me. She let me sit with the inability to say what needed to be said, the way a woman who has spent 30 years in hospice nursing has learned to let people sit with hard things. Because the sitting is itself a kind of work, and the rescue does not actually help. I tried again. "I read it," I said. "I know. All of it. I know. I did not know any of it. I know." I stopped. I looked at her hands. The hand on the formica was bare. She did not wear my mother's rings. She had never worn them. She had bought, when she had married my father in 1996, a simple gold band from a jewelry store on the east side, and she had worn it for 22 years, and she was wearing it now. My mother's rings, I realized, must be in a drawer somewhere in the house, waiting for me. "Era," I said. "I am sorry. I am so sorry. I have been so wrong about you. I have been so wrong about you for so long. I do not know how to begin." She did not move. You are beginning, she said. You are sitting here. That is the beginning. You have already begun. She reached across the table. She placed her hand over mine. I had not, in 22 years, ever been touched by Era Faulkner. Her hand was warm. Her hand was very warm. Her hand was the warmest thing in the diner. I cried. She let me cry. We sat in the third booth from the door, on the right side, at Marv's, on the night of my father's funeral, and I cried into a paper napkin, and she held my hand on the formica. And the waitress, who was a woman in her 50s with a kind face who knew Ira from the years of Sunday mornings, came over without being asked and refilled the coffee, and did not say a word and left us alone. I would like to tell you that the conversation at the diner that night resolved everything. It did not. We sat together for over 2 hours. I asked questions. She answered them. I asked her about my father. I asked her about my mother. I asked her about the years I had been gone. I asked her about Holden. I asked her about herself, which I had never, in 22 years, done. She answered each question carefully. She did not rush. She did not editorialize. She told me what she knew. She did not flinch. I learned, that night, things about Ira I had refused to know for 2 decades. She had grown up in Akron, the daughter of a railroad mechanic. She had been the youngest of 4. Her older brother had been killed in a car accident at 22, when she was 16, and the loss had broken her family in a way that had never been mended. She had become a nurse because she had wanted, after her brother's death, to be the kind of person who could be with people in their worst hours. She had not married until she met my father. She had been 34 when they married. She had been, before that, alone for a long time. She had not had children. She had not been able to have children, due to a condition she had developed in her late 20s. She had grieved that, privately, for the rest of her life. She had loved Holden and me, she said, from the moment she moved into the house. In a quiet way she had been careful not to perform, because she had known I would have hated any performance of love from her even more than I had hated her silence. She had decided to give me what I needed, which had been distance. She had given me distance for 22 years. I asked her, near the end of the conversation, why she had given me the envelope today and not earlier. She said, "Because your father asked me to wait until he was gone. He was afraid that if I gave it to you while he was alive, you would have one more reason to be angry with him, and he would not be able to bear it. He wanted me to give it to you after he was gone, so that you could be angry at him without him having to witness the anger." I did not say anything for a moment. "Are you angry?" she said. I thought about it. "I don't know yet," I said. Maybe a little. He could have told me about 1994. He could have told me years ago. I am not 12 anymore. I have been a grown woman for a long time, he could have told me. But I think I am more sad than angry. I think the anger will come and go. The sadness will stay. She nodded. That is how it has been for me, too, she said. About a lot of things. About him. We were quiet for a moment. Ira, I said. I want to ask one more thing tonight, and then I want to let you go home. Will you let me come over tomorrow? Will you let me come back to the house? I want to start again. I do not know how. I do not know what that looks like. I am 34 years old, and I have spent more than half of my life refusing to be in a room with you. I do not know how to be in a room with you. But I would like to learn. Will you let me try? She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were wet. Yes, she said. Of course. Of course, Imogen. Come tomorrow. Come whenever. The house is your house. It always was. We sat there. The waitress refilled the coffee one more time. We paid. Ira insisted. I let her. We walked out together. I drove her home. She let me. She had taken a cab to the diner, because she had not wanted to be sitting in our driveway during the gathering. I drove her back to the house. I parked in the driveway. I walked her to the door. She paused on the front step. "Imogen," she said. "Thank you for coming to the diner. Thank you for waiting. I would have waited longer. I know. I want to tell you that the months since have been beautiful and tidy. They have not been. The months since have been the slow, patient, awkward work of two women who had been strangers under the same roof for 22 years, figuring out how to be people in each other's lives. We have had dinners. We have had disagreements. We have had Sundays where Ira makes pancakes, badly, because she has remembered, from my mother's letter, that my mother used to make pancakes on Saturday mornings, and Ira has decided that Sunday pancakes are her way of acknowledging, without being intrusive, that she knows pancakes once mattered in this house. She does not say that. I have figured it out. I have not commented on it. I have eaten the pancakes. They are not as good as my mother's. They are also not bad. They are Ira's pancakes. I have grown to like them. I have asked her about my father. I have asked her about the years I missed. She has told me. I have learned, in the year since the funeral, more about my father than I had learned in the previous 22 years of his living life. I have learned that he loved music in a way I never knew. That he wept the day Holden was born. That he kept a small photo of my mother in his wallet until his last week of life. That he wrote me a letter every year on my birthday and never mailed it because he did not know what to say. And that the letters are in a folder in his desk drawer, waiting for me to read them. I am reading them slowly. One a year. I will be reading them for the next 34 years. I am not in a hurry. I want to tell you something about apologies. Because the apology I am still in the middle of giving Ira has taught me something I did not understand at 34. An apology for a single wrong is one transaction. It happens in a moment. You name what you did. You acknowledge the harm. You ask the other person what they need. You attempt to make repair. The transaction can be completed in an hour, sometimes in a sentence. Most of the apologies in adult life are this kind. An apology for 22 years of wrong is not a transaction. It is a project. It cannot be completed in a moment. It cannot be completed in a year. It is structured, instead, like a long, quiet construction project, the kind of construction in which the building goes up slowly, one beam at a time, with long pauses, and the workers do not look at the finished blueprint. Because the finished blueprint is too far away to think about, they look at the next beam. They place the next beam. They go home. They come back the next day. They place the next beam. I am, with Era, in the long quiet construction project. We are perhaps 2 years into it now. There will be many more years. The construction is small and daily. It is calling her on a Tuesday to ask how her doctor's appointment went, which I had been told about the week before, and which I made a note to remember. It is sending her a card when the anniversary of her brother's death comes around in March, because I have learned that the date is hard for her, and that nobody has ever sent her a card on it. It is asking her, when I visit, about her own life, her own opinions, her own preferences, none of which I had ever inquired about in the previous 22 years. It is letting her ask about my life, which I had never let her ask about, and answering her honestly, and letting her be interested. It is taking her, when she has needed it, to medical appointments she would otherwise have gone to alone. It is, in turn, letting her come to my events, a recent promotion celebration at my job, a small dinner for my 40th, hypothetically, when it arrives. It is letting her into the rooms of my life I had kept her out of, slowly, one room at a time. It is also forgiving myself, slowly, for the years I had her on the wrong side of my own door. That has been the harder construction. Forgiving the version of me who was 12, and 13, and 17, and 23, and 28, who carried a story so completely that she could not see past it. Forgiving that version of me has been a slow forgiveness too. I have had to remind myself, more than once, that the 12-year-old who built the story was a child who had just lost her mother and who had no other available tools. I have had to remind myself that the 17-year-old who refused to drive my mother's car had been protecting, in some interior way, her own right to grieve. I have had to remind myself that the 23-year-old who would not invite Ira to her college graduation had been performing a small, terrible loyalty to her own pain. I have had to remind myself that none of those previous versions of me were villains. They were each a daughter who had loved her mother so completely that the love had ossified into a defense against any woman who came after. I have had to forgive the defense. I have done it slowly. I am still doing it. The other thing I have done, in the 2 years since my father's funeral, is read my mother's letter once a year, on the anniversary of her death. I keep it in a small wooden box on my dresser. The box was my grandmother's. The letter is in it. On the 3rd of November every year, I take the letter out, and I read it, and I put it back. The letter is short. I do not need to read it for the information anymore. I read it because the act of reading it is itself an act of communion with my mother, who knew in the last weeks of her life that her family was going to need someone, and who had the courage to ask the woman who had been nursing her through her dying to be that someone, and who had also had the courage to write a daughter she would never know in adulthood, and tell that daughter, gently, to let her stepmother in eventually. My mother had been right. Eventually had taken 22 years. My mother had not lived to see the eventually. My mother had died believing in an eventually she could not verify. She had bet on me. She had bet that her fierce daughter would in time be the kind of woman who could be reached. She had bet correctly. I have, in the past year, started carrying her bet. I have started making my own bets. I have bet that the people I am angry at now, in this current decade of my life, may not be the people I think they are. I have begun to ask, more often, before deciding I have someone correctly figured out, am I missing something? Is there a letter someone is holding for me, sealed, that I have not yet been given? Is there a version of this person I have not seen? Is there a sage green chair I am furious about, that I should, perhaps, look at again? It has changed my life. It has, in particular, changed the way I am raising my own daughter, Ren, who is 6 and who has my mother's name as her middle name, and who has, hanging in her bedroom, a photo of 3 women my mother, taken before I was born, me, taken last year, and Ira, taken at the diner the night of my father's funeral, by the waitress, with permission. Because I had asked the waitress to take it before we left, because I had wanted for the rest of my life a record of the first time I had ever held Ira Faulkner's hand. The photo is on Ren's wall. Ren asks about it sometimes. I tell her about all 3 women. I tell her the story honestly. I do not hide the part where I was wrong. I do not hide it because I do not want my daughter to grow up believing that the women in her family were never wrong, or that the women in her family always saw clearly. We did not. I did not. I want her to know that her mother was wrong about something important, for a very long time, and that the wrongness did not end her, and that she found her way out of it, and that she is still finding her way out of it, and that the finding is itself the work of being alive in a family. That is what I want her to learn. That is what my mother, I think, would have wanted me to teach her. There is a thing I want to say to you, if you have watched this video to the end. I do not know what brought you here. I do not know whether you are a daughter, or a stepdaughter, or a stepmother, or a sister, or a mother. I do not know whether you have someone in your life you have hated, with quiet civility, for 10 or 15 or 22 years. I do not know whether the version of that person you have been carrying is accurate, or whether it is a story you built when you were too young to know better. I want to ask you, gently, only one thing. Is it possible, is it just possible, that the person you have spent the longest time being sure about is the person you have known the least? I am not asking you to forgive anyone today. I am not asking you to call them. I am not asking you to drive to a diner on Lakeshore at 9 in the evening on the night of anyone's funeral. I am asking only one quieter question. The question is, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Have you ever, in the years of your certainty, been willing to entertain the possibility that you might be wrong. I was not. For 22 years. I was not willing to entertain it. I built a fortress around my certainty. The fortress kept Era out. The fortress also, I now understand, kept me in. The fortress was as much a prison for me as it was a wall against her. I lived inside the fortress for 2 decades. I did not realize, until I came out of it, how much of my own life I had been giving up to maintain it. I had been giving up Christmas dinners I could have enjoyed. I had been giving up a stepmother I could have known. I had been giving up the chance to ask my father about his life. Because asking my father about his life would have meant being in a room with both of them, and I had not been willing to be in a room with her. I had been giving up the years. I do not have those years back. You may not have your years back either. But you can stop giving up the years going forward. You can put down the fortress. Slowly. One stone at a time. You can ask, before deciding you know who someone is, whether you have ever really looked at them. You can wonder if there is, somewhere in your story, a sealed letter from someone you loved, with someone else's name on the outside, asking that other person to be in your house. You can wonder if the other person has been quietly carrying that letter the whole time, waiting for you to be ready. You can be ready. It is not too late, if you are still alive, and they are still alive, and there is still a diner you can both drive to. I want to thank Ira Faulkner. I will not name her real name in this story. The name I have used here is not hers. She does not watch this kind of video. She would not want to be recognized. But I am thanking her, publicly, in the only way I can. She kept my father alive for 22 years. She kept the house running. She raised, in her quiet, undemanding way, the brother who is now my best friend. She received without complaint 2 decades of a daughter's quiet hatred. She did all of it because a dying woman had asked her to, and because she had loved a man who would not have survived without her, and because she had decided, when she was 33 years old, that her life would be lived in service of being present for people in their hardest hours. And that the cost of that life, including the cost of being misunderstood by a stepdaughter for 22 years, was a cost she was willing to pay. She paid it. I am, now, very slowly, paying her back. I want to thank, finally, my mother, Saoirse Faulkner, who died when I was 12, and who had the foresight, in the last weeks of her life, to write a sealed letter to a stranger asking that stranger to keep her family alive. And who had the patience to write a letter to her daughter, telling that daughter, gently, that the stranger was not actually a stranger. My mother had not been able to live long enough to see her family put back together. She had only been able to write the instructions for the putting back together, and trust that the people she loved would, eventually, follow them. We are still following them. The instructions are, let her in. We let her in. It took a long time. She is in. That is my story.